his idea is that Robert and others sent over from Beijing can pose as farmers, drive around the Midwest looking for seeds. In some cases, actually dig them out of the ground. In other cases, they would try to send them back to China in microwave popcorn bags. And that this way, the company could get the IP that it needs to produce next generation seeds. It's not so much that the Chinese government says, here, go out, go forth and spy, take this technology, bring it back to us, and then we'll pass it on to the company. Instead, it's that companies like DBN know that there will be few repercussions if they do manage to steal the technology. And so sometimes they decide on their own. Sometimes there are individuals who themselves decide to steal something or pocket a few documents and then look for buyers after the fact.
Hello and welcome to China Talk. I'm your host, Jordan Schneider. What do you get when you take a Chinese national, a rental car, rural Iowa, and a $52 billion seed business? Said one review, not since Alfred Hitchcock's North by Northwest has a cornfield produced so much excitement. Mara Hvistendahl's recent book, The Scientist and the Spy, presents a compelling narrative diving deep into the nature of Chinese industrial espionage and America's response. Mara, welcome to China Talk.
Thanks for having me on the show.
So as a longtime science journalist based in China, I can't but ask you if you have any insights that haven't been gleaned from Twitter over the past few days about what's happening with COVID-19. To be clear, we're recording this on March 9th.
Yes. So I covered the H7N9 outbreak when it happened in 2013. I did visit a biosafety level 3 facility. I guess the main thing is that there's been a lot of suspicion about the Chinese government's reaction. I think some of it's very warranted, but to keep in mind that there are many good researchers who are working as fast as they can to pass samples to their colleagues overseas. That's gotten a little. The other thing would be, don't be an armchair epidemiologist. I've seen a lot of those in the past few weeks.
Who do you think does it better, Chinese armchair epidemiologists or Americans?
At first, it was just journalists covering China, and then now it's just everybody.
Maybe just thinking back to your time based in Shanghai, are there any kind of encouraging China science stories that stick out in your head?
So I spent 8 years in China altogether, and 3 of them were with science. And during that time, I followed a number of researchers into the field. I went on archaeological digs. I went with a paleobotanist to a former coal mine in northwestern China and went digging for fossils there. And, there are a lot of very good researchers who are doing their best under the circumstances in China. Because of the lack of academic freedom and because of the turn that things have taken under Xi Jinping, there are a number of scandals.
What scandal most stuck out to you that was most illustrative?
So when I was working for Science, I did this 5-month investigation on a big paper selling ring. And what that entailed was that researchers, they would get the provisional acceptance of their paper. And then once it was sent out for review, they would add a few co-authors and sell slots on the paper. What that meant was that they're basically gaming the academic journal publication process. There are agencies that are dedicated to selling these slots on papers.
Oh boy.
It was a big story when it came out because previously it was known that you could just buy a paper if you wanted. But the fact that people were also selling slots on papers that had already gone through some part of the review process was pretty explosive. There's so much emphasis placed on publishing at all costs. It is really a publisher perish environment, to some degree much more than in the West, which is already quite bad. And so, researchers really have to secure publications. And for some people, for example, doctors or people working in biomedical field where they might also have a practice on the side, they just don't have time to do that research.
Well, had the American tenure system been a little more forgiving to our main character, we may not have had this wonderful book to read. Mara, let's start out by talking a little bit about Robert Moe. So who is he and how did he first come to the U.S.?
Robert Moe was an engineer from Sichuan province who moved to the United States in the 1990s, at a time when many Chinese researchers and students were moving to the US. He got his second PhD in the US in the field of thermodynamics, and then went looking for a job, had trouble finding one. And so he ended up getting this position through nepotism with a Beijing agricultural company called Dabeinong, or DBN. His sister was married to the CEO. And so, even though he knew nothing about agriculture, they gave him a job.
Let's take a step back. So, Mara, are all seeds the same?
No, all seeds are not created equal. Many of the seeds that are produced by US companies and some of the leading global companies are top notch. They get really high yields, and they're highly sought after.
And so this is a significant expense that farmers take on, is like buying seeds every year.
Farmers pay a lot for seeds. The companies also pay a fair amount to develop new seeds. But actually, as the industry consolidates, they're spending less and less on research.
Mm-hmm. At the time of your book's focus, which is the early 2010s, who were the leaders in this industry?
In the West, you had just a handful of big seed companies at the time. Two of the biggest were Monsanto and DuPont Pioneer, which make top of the line genetically modified seeds that go into everything from ethanol to food to animal feed.
So, how has Chinese industrial policy tried to catch up to the success that the Western seed manufacturers have been able to accomplish over the past few decades?
Improving the quality of the seed in China has been a major priority for the Chinese government because they see that people are eating diets richer in meat, and that China's population is still growing, and China has relatively little arable land. And so China's had to look to other markets to source corn. The shortcut would be for companies to come up with this high quality seed themselves. But this Chinese seed industry is very fractured, and companies like DBN are really no competition for the likes of Monsanto and DuPont Pioneer.
So, interestingly, the types of seeds that Western producers make are mainly GMO ones, which are banned in China for some reason.
Yes, basically, the government has held off on commercializing GM corn, and it's expected that it will be allowed eventually. But for now, companies are just kind of biding their time and hoping that one day they will be able to sell it in China.
So I can't imagine the motivation is quite the same as people protesting in London and Paris about the purity of their food.
Actually, protests have played a big role in it, and it's
Really?
just kind of yes, yeah. For many Chinese people, the debate over GM crops has come up at a time when there have been a lot of food safety scandals in China, and organizations like Greenpeace, which is very active in China, have managed to conflate the two. And for people who have very reasonable fears about the quality of food that they're eating based on everything that they've experienced over the past 10 years, they're reluctant to accept GM foods, but that may
Oh,
change.
so but there's also a dynamic of protectionism going on here potentially.
Oh, definitely. So looking back to 2011 when my book started, it was also possible at the time that the Chinese government was just biding its time until a Chinese company had a good stock of genetically modified seeds, and that then they would legalize them and allow companies to sell them.
Coming back to Robert Moore, he has this job. He's trying to do some business deals, but very quickly he starts getting pressure from up top to engage in a little more nefarious activity.
That's right. So, not that long after he joins DBN, his boss in China, a guy named Dr. Li, comes up with this elaborate scheme to steal seeds from Monsanto and DuPont Pioneer. His idea is that Robert and others sent over from Beijing can like pose as farmers, drive around the Midwest looking for seeds, In some cases, actually dig them out of the ground. In other cases, they would try to send them back to China in microwave popcorn bags. And that this way the company could get the IP that it needs to produce next generation seeds.
So this ends up leading to Robert and his boss driving around in rental cars to, the ruralest of rural Iowa, which does not have a ton of Asian Americans driving around, does it?
Not in corn country.
So what was his reception like?
Well, initially, Robert kind of enjoyed it. He at that point had lived in the US for many years. He has a wife and kids in Florida. He, in many ways, feels American. And, you know, I spent quite a long time talking with him, and he told me he visited the bridges of Madison County. He went to all these tourist sites. He loved the small towns with their little restaurants and their bars that have these neon lights that just say bar. And so initially he was really enjoying this assignment, but then as it veered into more and more illegal activity, he grew uneasy with what he was being tasked with doing.
And within a fairly short period of time, he starts attracting some police attention.
Yes, the book starts in Bondurant, Iowa, where Robert and a colleague are found near a Monsanto cornfield. This was a field where the company was growing next generation hybrid seed. The
Which
it
is
was a
not an easy thing to know.
no, locals know it, but the company tries to protect those fields as trade secrets. They, most cornfields in the area, if they're growing commercial corn that's going to be sent out to harvest, they'll have these little signs along the side that say the breed of corn that's growing there, and this field is unmarked.
Okay.
But for people who live in the area, you just need to watch for the Monsanto truck coming by a few times a season, and that it's a Monsanto field.
Sure. I guess my question at this point of the book was whether or not you were sort of insinuating that they were potentially inside of the Monsanto email registry, because I can't imagine the Dabenong deep connections in the rural Iowa farmer crew to sort of know the gossip of who was getting the fancy seed.
So very quickly, the FBI catches on to their appearance in this field, and one operating theory is that somebody has tipped them off to the location of this field.
Sure.
But that never was borne out, as far as I know.
So how do the police first get involved in this case?
So the Monsanto field is owned by a local farmer. He grows the corn under contract with Monsanto, and the company is so secretive about what's growing there that the seed just arrives in these unmarked bags every year. He's not told what kind of seed he's growing, and for all intents and purposes, it's the company's project. But he notices Robert's colleague standing in the middle of his cornfield, with his head down, scanning the ground for ears of corn. And so he calls the police. His wife is a police officer one town over. Some sheriff's deputies then race to the scene and question Robert and his colleague, and then kind of let them off with a warning, because they couldn't discern any illegal activity, maybe beyond trespassing. But one sheriff's deputy who showed up that day wrote up a report on the incident just in case. So the FBI had recently been tipped off to a similar incident in a pioneer field in another part of Iowa. And so when the FBI agent who is working that case hears of this Monsanto incident, suddenly you have two suspicious incidents involving cornfields, and he and an analyst, others in the office, start asking around.
There's a fantastic irony in your book where you talk to a number of scientists who say actually they only really needed to do this trip once, but the fact that Robert's boss didn't really have an understanding, A, of the sort of risks involved, and B, of the actual science that it took. Getting 500 different samples doesn't necessarily get you any faster to the cutting edge as just having one or two you can study from.
So that was part of what drew me to this case because it was such a harebrained scheme. And the more I talked with farmers and seed breeders and so forth, I realized that a lot of it was actually unnecessary. But then the FBI's reaction was also very outsized. So you had this protracted cat and mouse chase that went on for over 2 years.
Yeah. There's this narrative in the media that these Chinese firms are so sophisticated and they're really, they're stealing hundreds of billions of dollars of intellectual
Hmm.
property. But these are B-rate firms. And it's funny because even with a company like Huawei, who you figure is like the best in the world at this, they end up copying typos from routers. So once
Hmm.
you go a little further down the industrial food chain, it sort of makes sense that, okay, if this is a norm, there are going to be people who are like really poor at actually executing this sort of espionage.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is most telling about the Huawei case is that when Meng Wanzhou was arrested in Vancouver, she had several Apple devices on her. Yeah, so that shows the degree of faith in the company's technology.
Maybe she just didn't want the government spying on one or two of her phones. That's my
Yeah,
theory. But
maybe.
anyway,
Um, there are companies that are very good at this, and there have been sophisticated cyber attacks. There have also been more bungled kind of low end operations by hustlers basically. And so I mean, that's one of the popular misconceptions about these cases is that in the most for the most part with technologies like corn seed and non-dual use technologies, it's not so much that the Chinese government says, here, go out, go forth and spy, take this technology, bring it back to us, and then we'll pass it on to the company. Instead, it's that companies like DBN know that there will be few repercussions if they do manage to steal a technology. And
yeah,
so sometimes they decide on their own. Sometimes there are individuals who themselves decide to steal something or pocket a few documents and then look for buyers after the fact. So
sure.
all of these things are going on at the same time, and there isn't one typical case.
Have you read For All the Tea in China, Mara?
Yes, I read that when I was researching this book.
My favorite Chinese industrial espionage story is actually one committed by the British East India Company. So after the Opium War, when China just starts opening up a tad, this British civil servant type dresses up in Mandarin garb and ends up persuading 10 or 15 tea experts to go to India to teach the sorry Indian tea farmers how to step up their game and make internationally palatable product. And she has this fascinating story because there's this guy and he's like sneaking around and
Hmm.
all the local mandarins try to arrest him and he like gets away in the dead of night. I think one of the things that you mentioned in your book is this is something that's been going on for a long time, and the history isn't always necessarily of Western companies and countries having their hands completely clean when it comes to these sorts of issues.
That's right. And the CCP messaging, I guess I should say, has gotten a little bit more sophisticated. But Deng Xiaoping, for example, once said, "Did we charge the West for the printing press and for gunpowder and for all these other inventions?" I mean, that's true. At the same time, it has gotten a lot easier to steal technologies, and it's clearly happening on a very widespread scale. Um,
I might take an issue. I might take an issue with that statement because on the one hand, like, yeah, okay, I guess you can like hack someone's computer and download all this stuff, but on the other hand, you can argue the Americans. I think you mentioned this in your book. The Americans have had a story where Alexander Hamilton was subsidizing people who would steal schematics
mhm.
from the UK of mills or something, and it doesn't take once you have the schematics, you can just like give it to like your carpenter around the corner and he can build your watermill, right? But this is very different. The sort of Okay, so say you steal a hybrid seed, right? The amount of sort of like institutional knowledge and support and education, an entire system in order to operationalize the stuff that you're stealing in 2020 is very different. Sort of industrial espionage, which was much lower tech because like the world was lower tech 100 or 200 years ago.
That's true, and there is a real debate among scholars and others who study this issue about how effective it is to steal these technologies.
Sure.
It's pretty clear that it's a short term strategy, and that companies like DBN are not really thinking forward, maybe even 10 years, let alone like 20 or 30 years. They're looking at like, if we get this seed line, we can commercialize it within 2 to 3 years and beat out our competitors. The the Chinese economy is an environment that does encourage short-term thinking right now.
Sure.
In the long run, will that undercut the United States technological edge? That is an issue of debate.
Um, the FBI, when and why do they start caring about these sorts of industrial espionage cases?
Economic espionage became a crime in the mid 1990s amid a soul searching brought on by the end of the Cold War. After the Cold War was over, we lost our major adversary. There was a kind of casting about for a new focus within the intelligence agencies. And at the same time, you had former agents around the world going to work for corporations and be going into corporate security. There was a lot of concern about France in particular. There was this story that the French intelligence services had bugged the first class cabins on Air France flights and were somehow gleaning information out of that. Yeah, it's like questionable how much they actually got,
So this
but
is why the Concorde really got shut down?
I don't know. Yeah, so that was one of the big concerns at the time, and economic espionage became a crime in 1996 when President Clinton signed the Economic Espionage Act into law. But then 9/11 happened. Our focus shifted to terrorism and counterterrorism, and it wasn't really until the late aughts that we began pursuing industrial espionage cases in earnest. And that's when you saw the FBI create a dedicated unit, economic espionage unit. Fighting this sort of technology theft from China is now one of their top priorities. And over the past few years, especially, there's just been a rapid uptick in cases, to the point where FBI Director Christopher Wray says that there are now over 1,000 active investigations involving China and technology.
Jeez. So, an interesting dynamic that you really brought to the floor is the public-private sector cooperation, I guess is the nice spin, or the FBI becoming operationalized to benefit corporate interests, which is the more cynical one. So, how is this cooperation supposed to work ideally between the FBIs and the firms who are getting their stuff stolen? And how can it run awry?
So, in the early 1990s, there was this debate over whether the United States should actively spy for economic secrets and for the gain of our companies. There were many people who felt that this would actually be a good idea because the French were doing it, the Israelis were doing it, and why not just get into the game? There were others who felt like we don't need to. It would be very complicated to do so, but we should criminalize economic theft when it happens. So that's what we ultimately ended up doing. So our stance now is that we spy for national security purposes like every other country, but we do not spy for the purposes of our own corporation's gain. That is the US
Yeah.
government's stance.
I feel like Trump would be sort of down with this. I remember he was at one point pushing the U.S. to end the anti-bribery laws.
Peter Navarro, his trade advisor of dubious qualifications, recently wrote an article saying that economic security is national security, and so that's something that the Trump administration has been pushing harder.
So In interacting with these FBI agents, this isn't like the sexiest of things to be investigating. I'm sure, when they were all teenagers dreaming of being, G-men, this is necessarily the sorts of stories that they wanted to be, in the news for. So I'm curious, are you kind of lame if you're on the economic espionage desk, or is it
Mm.
now a cool thing to do? What was your sense of like this sort of like emotional reaction that these FBI agents had to to helping like very large, pretty multinational companies at this point, protect their intellectual property?
Well, I should say I spent quite a bit of time talking with the lead FBI agent on this case and talking with others in the FBI. Interviewing current FBI agents can be a little bit like interviewing a wall. Like, they are trained to not give a
Sure.
lot of information. But my sense is that this has become such a priority that even if you're working something like the theft of hybrid corn seed, you know that it could be a big case
Yeah.
just because there's so much emphasis on it. And so, on its face, it's really not a sexy topic at all, but it is one that really has the eyes and ears of leadership. And so I would assume that there's a draw in that.
So again, Mauer, coming back to the sort of cooperation with companies angle.
Yes. So to bring these cases, the FBI works very closely with corporations. And the argument is that companies would not come forward with breaches unless they're quite confident that their trade secrets are going to be protected and so forth. The risk in this cooperation is that companies' claims about their technologies can go unquestioned. And so, especially with cases involving China, you have this trifecta of difficult issues. You have complex technologies, like even something like corn breeding requires a lot of background and a lot of learning about the technology. China, also very complicated in terms of governance structure and figuring out, whether a company has strong connections to the government and so forth. And then IP law, which is also very complex. And there's a complicated calculation that goes into like, is something a trade secret or is it not a trade secret? And so you have agents in places like Iowa, Missouri, really every state in the country who are now tasked with investigating these very difficult cases that involve these very complex topics.
Yeah, no, this is a dynamic I think that is really across the government, where there's only really so much expertise, and the people who know the most about it are the ones, in the private sector. I remember the famous case. There was like this fantastic New Yorker article about this, high frequency trader, and sort of Goldman Sachs basically like persuaded the Department of Justice that this guy was a criminal, but there was this whole 10,000 word piece about raising questions as to whether or not it was, and it sort of came out ambiguous. But I think that the clearest takeaway was that in fact the government lawyers had very little sense of what was actually going on in the business, which may or may not have been a crime.
Sure. So for example, to go back to the case of Robert Moore, the case that's in my book, at one point, the lead agent on the case cites the fact that Robert is speaking Chinese with a woman in the industry as a basis for getting a warrant, among other factors. So things like that. It's very common for two ethnic Chinese people to speak Mandarin with each other, and yet we still see this idea cropping up in warrants and in government arguments as this is a basis for suspicion.
Sure. So this brings us to this broader tension that the U.S. government is facing, where on the one hand, there is this real threat of both corporate and military espionage from the Chinese government, but at the same time, there are big downsides, both moral and strategic, from painting everyone with an Asian ethnic background as a potential or active foreign agent. So maybe to kick off this part of the discussion, you want to start by describing this idea of the CCP strategy of 1,000 grains of sand and how it took hold in the U.S. imagination?
Sure. So when I set out to tell the story of Robert Moore, I realized that I needed to understand the history of the way that the FBI has looked at these cases involving China in the past. It's a fraught history. I mean, many people have heard of the case of Wen Ho the Los Alamos scientist who was the subject of a botched investigation in the late 1990s and culminated in an apology from President Clinton. There was that. But then I dug deeper, and one operating theory that the FBI used for years and still has some currency within some quarters was this notion that of 1,000 grades of sand. And the idea behind that was that if intelligence collection were aimed at determining the composition of sand on a beach, that the United States and Russia would use sort of James Bond like tactics to go out and determine what sand was there. So they might send agents in the middle of the night, they might do reconnaissance, whereas China would simply send thousands of people to the beach to lie in the sun, and then at the end of the day they would take their towels home and shake out their towels, and somehow all of this sand would be assembled into a complete picture, and China would end up with a lot of sand. So that was the idea. It's a theory that first of all struck me as representing a very incomplete picture of the way the Chinese government operates. I mean, it's a bureaucracy in the worst sense of the word. There, one. So the idea that this sort of sophisticated assembly of pieces of information would work just seemed incorrect. But then this theory also harkens back to racist tropes dating back to the late 1800s. So, the idea of yellow peril, um, the notion that there were hordes overwhelming our borders. These are ideas that we haven't completely purged from analysis of China, and to some degree continue to shape thinking on investigations. But I should say that the opinions of many analysts have shifted. That theory is being discarded to some degree, and the problem is that the one that's replaced it is much less catchy. It's basically the idea that China uses a whole range of tactics, and some of them look a lot more like what the United States and Russia do, traditional spying, and then some are more uniquely Chinese. But that's not really a catchy metaphor that you can easily sell to the press or to others within the intelligence agencies.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. It's like if you are poor and you don't have highly trained James Bonds running around, or a drone that can go and scoop up a piece of sand, then you're going to do whatever you can. And as the line is like consumption upgrade in China, everyone's buying fancier cars and getting organic milk and whatnot. I'd imagine like espionage upgrade is also something that happens once you have more resources to put towards these
No,
issues.
but I don't think that that theory was ever correct. I think it says more about the way that we in the West conceptualize Chinese espionage than anything else. It says more about Western biases and assumptions and the way that racism continues to shape our conception of China than it does anything else.
Sure. So maybe go a bit deeper into the idea that the CCP tries to weaponize ethnic Chinese from all around the world.
That idea is still one that you see people within the intelligence communities repeating. Um, it's very fraught. There is a degree of truth to the fact that the CCP would like to weaponize people, but it would love to weaponize white people as well. So over the past few years, there have been a number of cases involving non-ethnic Chinese, and these are both national security and industrial espionage cases. And so focusing on ethnicity, first of all, is wrong. But its second leads us astray in that we could end up missing cases.
But to what extent do you feel these like somewhat racialized theories ended up impacting the investigation that you spent your time looking into?
I used this case of Robert Moore to tell a larger story, and it happened at the same period as a number of other investigations were brought. I mean, really dozens of cases over the period that they that that case spanned. And so I structured the book by telling the story of that case and then wrapping some of these other cases around it. And there's no question that ethnicity played a role in many other cases. Um, in the case of Robert Moore, he, clearly did go into fields to take seed. The FBI had a lot of evidence of his intent. But at the same time, this issue was becoming so fraught nationally, and the language around the discussion around these cases, people were using metaphors of animals, and um, a number of Asian American community groups were advocating around the issue and growing increasingly concerned. Many Chinese researchers began to feel like they were being targeted, and so all of that did have an impact on the case, and it got to the point when his case did not go to trial, but the the pretrial proceedings dragged on for several years, and the judge in the case actually ruled that if it did go to trial, that his ethnicity would be off limits, and so the two sides would not be able to bring up his Chineseness unnecessarily.
Yeah. What would that end up having meant?
I gather that it would have meant that, for example, the government could not have presented testimony on how pervasive Chinese industrial espionage is, for example. That they could not have insinuated that the case of Robert was tied to these other cases.
Sure.
And there was a real concern on the part of the defense that a jury in a place like Iowa could be prejudiced against a defendant simply because he was ethnically Chinese.
Sure. So Robert ends up taking a guilty plea, which will have him spending years in jail, and then end up getting deported back to China. So Robert ends up pleading guilty, and when he speaks to you, he very clearly thinks that this is has everything to do with ethnicity.
Yes, I mean he's not an extremely reliable narrator in the book. He's a very
Sure.
colorful narrator. He speaks in metaphor. He spent a long time talking to me about his childhood, about his poetry, about when he in prison he ended up befriending a pretty well-known um, defendant in an economic espionage case. So he was in prison with these other well-educated ethnic Chinese scientists, and they would play ping pong together and talk about Chinese history, and so that was this like strange reality that he inhabited. Um, he did come out of the whole experience somewhat jaded, understandably. And I think it did seem to me by the end of my reporting that to some degree he was a little bit of a pawn in this global competition between the United States and China, because he was ultimately a fairly low level employee within DBN, and the company itself suffered very few repercussions. So the government was hoping to arrest the people above him. They hoped to get his boss. There were several other people who were charged, and those guys are now all still on the FBI's most wanted list. At one point, they charged Robert's sister, and then the charges against her were dropped. They were somewhat specious, and so despite massive amounts of money that were spent on this investigation, the company continues to do just fine. Its stock prices are high. It may even have the seed lines that it stole in production, and so at the end of the day, One guy went to prison, and that's it.
I
Sorry, let
know.
me
I mean, my
rephrase
takeaway
that.
from reading this is however many, millions of dollars would have that were spent to prosecute this case had they just gone into, Iowa State scholarships for, the future seed engineers of America would probably have done more to protect and support this industry than all of this legal wrangling, which ended up only getting a sad sack low level employee of a Chinese firm in jail.
Well, that's another issue. So when you look at some of these industries, and the seed industry is really stark. There's been massive consolidation over the past few decades, to the point where just a handful of companies now control the bulk of the market. And so when you look at boosting innovation in America, breaking up monopolies is one way to do that. I mean, as the companies have grown larger, they have spent less and less on research as a percentage of their sales. The seed prices for farmers have risen, and the seed is not improved measurably or by the same degree, and so that is a significant issue as well. The Justice Department under Obama, when the Robert Mueller investigation started, did actually have a an antitrust inquiry involving Monsanto, and that was dropped over the period that this investigation played out. Now, there were several other antitrust inquiries involving other agricultural companies that were dropped over the same period, and these are fairly difficult to bring. But at the end of the day, that would have had a real impact on the livelihoods of farmers and consumers, to a degree to which this IP theft investigation did not.
I also like how at the end Monsanto gets acquired by Bayer, of course a German company. So all this ends up doing is protect what ends up becoming German IP.
That's right, right. I mean, so that's the big irony of the book, is that there's this argument made continually um, by the Justice Department that these investigations and these cases protect innovation in America. But ultimately, all of this money was spent on the case, and then Monsanto left the U.S. I mean,
Um,
it's an unequal playing field in a way, because companies like Huawei are beholden to the Chinese government on some level, and you can debate the degree to which they are, but clearly they are. And then multinationals in the United States really do not have the same allegiance to the U.S. government, and these investigations have been brought almost under the assumption that they do.
mm. So what do you think is the right response then? I know you're a journalist, not a think tanker, but if you
Yeah,
had to put on this hat.
we just diagnose the problem and then leave it to other people to solve it. we Well, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that the US research force is comprised of many researchers from overseas, a large number of whom are from China. And so any solution has to ensure that we continue to make foreign born scientists feel welcome.
So let's close on Charles Lieber, who, as NPR wrote, until late last month lived the quiet life of an American elite scientist until the FBI came knocking on his door. So how does his story and taking of relatively illicit Chinese money end up feeding into this whole dynamic?
So when I started looking at these cases, many of them involved corporate IP and the theft of corporate trade secrets. Over the past 2 years, there has been a shift to cases involving grant fraud, and particularly National Institutes of Health money. And that those investigations involve the FBI working together with NIH, and they've played out at a number of universities. Charles Lieber is the biggest fish caught so far. I think the important thing to note about those cases is that in several cases, the FBI has gone in, investigated people closely, and then not brought any charges. And so that has created a lot of confusion. In other cases, like the case of Charles Lieber, you have people who are charged with fraud or with lying to the US government, and there's not any evidence that IP was actually stolen. And, it's possible that it may have been in the case of Charles Lieber. He's working with a very sensitive technology, but all of these cases are being conflated. So you have the IP theft cases being conflated with the fraud cases. And much of what's happening with the FBI and NIH investigations is simply incidents of scientists double dipping or accepting money from China at the same time that they are working for a US institution. And that is not espionage. It's often conflated in the headlines, and I wish that people would get it straight.
Mara, any sort of like interesting responses since publishing the book from the US or from mainland readers?
There are a number of people within the US intelligence community who still want to debate whether Wen Li was guilty. And so I've heard from a number of those people. It's interesting. I think ultimately he did not get a fair investigation. And so we can debate it all we want, but I think we probably would do best to learn from that and move forward and ensure that future people do get fair investigations.
Mara, thanks so much for being a part of China Talk.
Thanks again for having me on the show.
Today's game. Hawks travel to Ann Arbor next weekend to battle Michigan.